This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Sunday, November 6th. One of the great challenges that men face, and this is pretty obvious as soon as you attempt to study as an adult, one of the great challenges is to figure out what we should study and how, because there's just so much stuff. When you think that the sacred scriptures began to be composed more than 1,000 years before Christ, and men have been writing ever since, and you look at the volumes and volumes and volumes of written material that's available, it becomes obvious pretty quick that we're not going to read everything. And therefore we have to figure out what we're going to read. And even more importantly, we're going to have to figure out how to read it. And what most men do is exactly the opposite of what they should do, which is why they don't make much progress. I always tell my students, though they never listen to me, the parents that I advise don't listen to me, the students that I advise don't listen to me, I advise them to concentrate on living a balanced life, because you can only make progress in studies if you're living a responsible life. No matter how much I tell people this, they still walk away with this idea that cramming and studying and sitting at a table and reading books is the way to study, and they're wrong. It's not how studies work, not how studies ever worked for wise men, and it's not how studies will ever work. The ideas that people have about how to study are simply wrong. It's not how wise men studied in the past. It's not how wise men will study in the present. And yet everyone has this image of studying that they want to pursue, even though it doesn't work. Like I said, most people have an idea of studying which they pick up when they're in school. They go to a modern school, a modern college, and they get an idea of what it feels like to study. And they think of how they studied for this exam in college and how they tucked themselves away in the library and got their books all ready and took notes and crammed to study for that exam. And they remember back to this glory day when they did well in a subject, and they say, one of these days I'm going to get back and I'm going to study again. And they think of school studies, academic studies, as real study. And the truth is that that's not real study, because the nature of schooling is itself artificial. It's easy to work like that when you have a 16 or 20 week semester and then you're finished and you get a month off. It's easy when you have to cram for a few days for an exam, and then you can relax for the next 3 weeks. That artificial schedule, the credit-based, exam-based studies is not philosophical learning. It's not how real learning works. And the great books that were written by history's wisest and best men were never intended for someone to sit down and study like a textbook. It's impossible to study them like that. That's just not how wisdom is sought through studies. And I can give you a clear example of this based on how the church handles and presents to us the content of sacred subjects. In the sacred scriptures, God has given us over 1,000 pages of content written by dozens and dozens of different authors over thousands and thousands of years. Or I should say thousands of years, not thousands and thousands. How will anyone read or study the sacred scriptures? And so we see people have all different ideas. They say, I'm going to read through the Bible in a year. And that's fine. It's fine to read through the Bible in a year. Like there's the popular Father Mike Schmidt's Read Through the Bible in a Year program. Okay, that's great. So you read through the Bible in a year. Then what? What do you do after that? Then you've got students in seminaries who are taking sacred scripture courses or theology courses, and they're studying for a semester or for a few semesters. Okay, what do you do after that? You've got 30, 40, 50 years ahead of you. What are you going to do for those 30, 40, 50 years? Because that's how wisdom is actually gained. It's not gained from the theology class at seminary. It's not gained from read through the Bible in a year. We've got 70, 80 years to live. How are we supposed to study? We're not supposed to study for a few years when we're teenagers or until we're 25 or so. We're not to study for 1 year using an online podcast. Study is supposed to be what we do daily. Psalm 1 says, the godly man meditates day and night on the law of the Lord. How does this studying work? How does this real, lifelong, philosophical studying actually work? And this is why I always advise my students to establish a balanced, responsible life. Because real study, lifelong study, can only take place in a balanced, responsible life. If you don't establish a balanced life, you cannot be a philosopher. Your life is going to be chaotic and distracted. It's unstable. And you're not going to be able to grow in wisdom because you're always going to be in survival mode, trying to figure out how to make money. And you can't pursue wisdom under pressure of making money. You can't. If you've got responsibilities to fulfill and you're not fulfilling them, you cannot seek wisdom. And just think about it. Your life is being lived in contradiction to any wisdom. So why would you even be talking about seeking higher wisdom when you're struggling to even provide for yourself, which is something that peasants can do? The common people can work and provide for themselves, even for their own families. And this idea that we seek learning instead of responsible living, or we seek learning by going all in on studies rather than in living a balanced life, is just foolishness. And yet this is how people commonly think of learning. We gain wisdom by a combination of our studies and our experience gained over decades and decades of responsible living. We gain wisdom, let me say this again, we gain real wisdom through a combination of our experiences in real life and in our studies over decades and decades as we live responsibly. We fulfill our duties first, and we seek wisdom as we fulfill our duties, not instead of fulfilling our duties. If our life is not rightly ordered, we cannot grow in wisdom. Scripture tells us wisdom will not enter into a soul enslaved to sin. The anxiety and confusion that are present in a soul that's not taking care of its responsibilities in life prevent it from gaining wisdom. There's a calmness, there's a peacefulness of mind that's necessary for real studies. And that peacefulness, that calmness or tranquility can only be enjoyed by a person who's living responsibly. One doesn't need to be wealthy to seek wisdom. One doesn't need a professional career. One doesn't need to be married with children. One can choose to devote his life to religion or to study and live a responsible, balanced life. If one chooses to marry, he takes upon himself all the burdens of family life, and he's got to tend to those before he can pursue wisdom through studies. Because like St. Paul said, if anyone doesn't provide for his own family, he's worse than an unbeliever. Because unbelievers do these things. And yet here we have Christians talking about wisdom who don't even provide for their own families. And you're not going to fool anyone with that silly life. You've got to live a responsible life. And when you establish a responsible life, then you can seek real learning. Now, once we establish a responsible life, and by responsible I mean a life where a man bears his own burden. You're not leaving your provision to others. You're not leaving your dependents to fend for themselves. If you choose to get married, you have to provide for your wife. If you choose to have children, you have to provide for your children. None of this fake religion where men sit around idle and send their wives to work so they can read books. That's not responsible living. That's not a life seeking wisdom. That's a man pretending to be interested in books while he neglects his duties. And that man will never grow in wisdom. You've got to provide for your family first, if you choose to have one. And when your family is stable, then you can devote your leisure time, your own time, to the pursuit of the studies that are proper for wise men, or men seeking wisdom. And these studies are convenient studies. These studies can be studied by a busy man over a long period of time. And a responsible man seeks this learning over time, not all at once, not through cramming, not in a year. A responsible man seeks this learning over a span of years and years, making use of his free time to pursue these studies. And that's how they work. I'll give you an example of how I seek these studies. I have 10 children to provide for, a family of 12, ages 7 up through 22. I have 3 children in college. And so you can imagine all of the talk about how expensive it is to raise children, all of these pressures. I have to bear all of these pressures. I have to provide for these children whom I chose to produce. Their provision is my responsibility, just as their production was my choice. And so I work to earn what our family needs for its provision. I also have to manage my household so that we do things wisely and don't waste what is earned, but make prudent use of it. I've got to provide for my wife as well, not just financially, but also spiritually, socially, and so on. And this takes the bulk of my time. I've got a very challenging duty to fulfill to my family, to provide for them. And when I was in my 20s, I was already thinking about how I was going to go about providing for my family in a way that would allow me to pursue wisdom. I didn't just go find a job. I didn't just take the normal course. I was thinking while I was in college what I would do with my life that would allow me to both provide for my family and pursue wisdom as I wanted to. So my life is not pulled in different directions. I'm always focused on the pursuit of wisdom. I'm always focused on religion. And yet at the same time, I provide for my family. When I'm at my desk, I limit myself to necessary work, gainful work that actually pays my bills. High stress, challenging work that pays the bills. That's what I work on at my desk. I work set hours. I work from 10 to 5 every day, intensely. And then I take a break at 5 o'clock. I get out for some physical exercise, 2 hours or so of physical exercise. And then in the evening, I get washed up, have dinner and evening prayer with my family, and then I settle in for the night to continue working on whatever else needs to get done. And I'm talking about professional work. And I keep that schedule throughout the year with my family's needs as the measure of when that work can be considered done. My spare time, whatever there is of it, I devote to studies, to the pursuit of wisdom through studying and reading. But I never do this at a desk. I always do this while I do other things, while I get physical exercise and so on. And technology makes this more possible than ever. Now, it's important to understand that in the ancient world, men like Cicero, wise men in the ancient world, they didn't sit around at their desk reading books. Wise men had servants. And the servants were usually students. They might even have had students sent to them in sort of an apprenticeship relationship. And these wise men would assign these students or servants to read to them while they did other things. And they would be constantly listening to these readings. And so they would tend to their activities while they listened to the reading of the writings of other philosophers and wise men, of the sacred scriptures and so on. They would be constantly listening. And they did this through the service of servants or apprentices or students. They'd be constantly listening, constantly hearing these works read, and just listening, thinking, and so on. They would constantly be listening because their goal was to become familiar with all that the great writers had written. They wanted to simply be familiar with what was contained in the books. Now, as they're familiar with the content of these books, they're simultaneously living responsible lives. And in their lives, they're constantly asking themselves, as they have decisions to make, as they have business actions to take and so on, they're asking themselves, what have I read or heard in the writings of wise men that can help me solve this problem? And then if there's a certain activity where they realize that there was something that they had read or something that they had heard in this book or that book, they can then seek out the details of that place in the reading and reflect on it more intently and use it in their deliberations about their practical affairs. And they can allow their lives and their decisions to be informed by the writings, by the wisdom of the masters. But they would only be able to do that if they were constantly hearing the books read, not for mastery, but for familiarity, for use at appropriate times. Now, as I said, in our generation, technology makes this easier than ever. We have audiobooks that allow us to constantly listen to the writings of wise men. And again, we're not listening to them for any kind of academic mastery, nor can any academic programs provide us with any mastery of these books, which is what's deceiving about academic studies, is that men pretend that they're something that they're not. Men pretend that academic studies are the path to mastery, and they pretend that degrees and diplomas and things earned through academic studies are some kind of sign of mastery when they're not. Because every course in a school is limited. The content is restricted, pieces are chosen, pieces are left out, and that's not how mastery is pursued. So academic life is a real distraction in modern society, because academic life is just for professional pursuits. It has nothing to do with real learning. And you've got to protect yourself against this, because the people who pursue academic things, who pursue the degrees, who pursue the certificates, they like to try and bully others and pretend that these diplomas and degrees they've earned are some kind of authorization, like they're somehow ordained to a certain ministry and have some authority because they have a degree. But academic degrees are no such thing. The only reason anyone pursues an academic degree is because some position they would like to obtain requires it. The degree itself, outside of a professional context, is irrelevant. We have no idea what anyone's academic degree signifies in terms of their actual mastery. Anyone who's been to college knows that the difference between a straight A student and a student getting C's is an amazing difference. You can just show up to class and get C's through college and get a degree. No one is studying hard to get C's. And if they say they are, they're lying. They're just cramming at certain times because they've neglected to study throughout the bulk of the semester. But if you just go to class and submit your assignments, you'll end up with C's at least in college. To get straight A's is much more challenging, but the straight A's are not required for the degrees. And the degrees don't mark their recipients as the straight A students. There are other measures of these things, graduating with honors, honor societies, things like that. They usually measure the quality of work that a student does during their college. You also have to consider the school. It's easy to go to a lower quality school and earn high grades because the teachers aren't as good, the expectations are lower, and so on. So there's almost no significance to academic diplomas and degrees, and we all know this, especially those who teach. They know it more than anyone. And because these academic programs don't allow you to read through the materials and pursue them for mastery, they're really useless outside of professional needs. But mastery comes, first of all, through living a responsible life and listening to the full texts of the greatest masters. And again, we have to distinguish here between what are popularly called the great books, which is just entertaining literature, and the actual writings of the masters, the wise men, the philosophers. These are two very different things. There's almost no so-called great books program that leads students through the readings of Cicero's philosophical writings, or Seneca's moral philosophy, or Aristotle's Organon. And these are the real master works. The great books programs usually focus on entertaining literature. The poems of Homer and Virgil, modern literature, and so on. Maybe the Greek plays. But these aren't the works that wise men read. These were works written for entertainment. We can make an exception. We can say that the writings of Homer were intended to be sort of a guide of life. But the people teaching these books in great books courses don't have the philosophical background to be able to get into those lessons in the writings of Homer. They don't see them. They focus on the story and the characters and the events in the story and miss the deeper things that only men trained in philosophy and rhetoric would even discern. And this is the deception of modern great books programs. They don't actually study the great books. They study famous works of literature from history, but they neglect the real great books. Then when we look at these real great books, we say, man, these things are massive. Aristotle's Organon. How am I going to read through that? Pliny's Natural History. How am I going to read through that? Cicero's philosophical writings, Seneca's moral philosophy. How am I going to get through these collections of dense, intense philosophical instruction? How am I going to get through that? And the answer is, you're not. Unless you listen through it for years and years and years, and you make use of what you hear as you continue to listen through it and live responsibly for years and years and years. So as I was saying before, I listen to recorded readings of these works while I do other things. For example, if I take time in the afternoon after my office hours are finished to go for a run, or to go to the gym, or to walk, or to go work in the garden, I will always use that time to listen to the writings of the wise men. I'll always have on the Summa Theologica, the Summa Contra Gentiles, Pliny's Natural History, the works of Aristotle, the dialogues of Plato, the philosophical works of Cicero, the moral writings of Seneca. I'll always have these on and be listening through them as I do these other things. And as I listen, I'm not even attempting at any mastery. I don't stop and back up or anything like that. I just listen. I just survey. I just listen to all of the content, listen to the topics that are discussed, and occasionally, based on what I'm actually doing in my life at the time, occasionally a passage will stick out and get my attention as I'm listening. For example, yesterday I was working in the garden listening to Pliny's Natural History. And in current events, we're hearing all about this controversial talk about genders and gender identity and things like that. So that's, these current events and current topics are always on my mind. And as I was listening to Pliny, we came upon a chapter in his discussions of man, and he talks about how in the ancient world there were cases where individuals were known to change their gender. Or I should say, there were cases in history where people's gender was known to have changed during their lives. And he talks about these events, talks about these cases. And so as I'm listening, all of a sudden I come into a discussion about controversial gender issues in the ancient world. And my attention perks up because this is a relevant subject in modern or current events. And so I listen to what Pliny, who is a conservative Roman philosopher, has to say about it, and I realize that he gives credence to the argument that these changes were not just some kind of depraved personal choice, but that they were actually real, natural changes that took place in people's lives. He gives one example about a woman who was married, and then after her marriage, she began to produce facial hair naturally. And she changed. She basically became man-like physically. And so we see that even through history, there was confusion and controversy concerning these issues, that this isn't just some modern fad or political movement that we're to fight against politically, but there's more to it, as even the ancient philosophers would grant. There's more to these things. And so that helps me in thinking about and writing about the modern controversies, because we see the church advising us to be careful in these matters, that it's not just political, that there are real challenges, real issues that people face in these controversies. And we're to reserve judgment, because it's not so simple. And I now have support for the church's advice from a wise old philosopher that I picked up just as I was doing my common listening while I worked in the garden. And that's how a lot of my thinking develops, how I make decisions and things like that. Over time, I'm constantly listening, and current issues on my mind will be addressed by the things that I'm listening to. And this is how I am constantly enlightening my deliberations, decisions, controversies I'm thinking through, and so on. I'm constantly having my judgment informed by the writings of wise men, by constantly hearing all of the things that they've taught. And you can see how different this is than the modern irresponsible quote sharing that people do, where someone finds a verse in a book that they've never read. They find a quote that appears to support what they already think. And rather than seeking to examine their own opinions and reserve judgment, they simply look for quotes where the words seem to support their opinions. And that's not wisdom seeking. Especially when the quotes are being taken from books that the people have never read. They don't even know what the context of the quote was. And the use of quotes in that way is really useless. It's irrational to use quotes in that way, because the quotes don't actually prove your opinions true until after you've established the context and have proven that the context of the original quote, its intention, all of the words and their meanings perfectly agree with what you're saying. And this is never done. But this is how wisdom is pursued in the life of a man who fulfills his responsibilities and lives a balanced, responsible life while constantly hearing and reflecting on the words of wise men. That's how it works. The same thing happened a month or so ago. I was running on the treadmill at the gym one evening after work, listening through the Summa Theologica, and I came upon an article where Thomas Aquinas discusses prudence, and the discussion on prudence solved a dilemma that I had in my life on a related issue. And so I was able to finish my workout, go home, and then open up that place where I had heard that helpful bit about prudence, was able to dig into it and use that text to deliberate and make decisions on a separate matter. That's how I constantly study the writings of wise men within the context of my own life and vocation. I study over the course of years and years. There's no pressure to get through anything. There's no artificial schedule. No read through blankety blank in a year or anything like that. It's just a constant hearing of the writings of wise men, and just allowing my own life's dilemmas and questions and decisions to guide me in what I should reflect on as I listen through these works. And you can see how that's a responsible study. I'm not studying at the expense of my family. I'm not sacrificing time at the office or time on necessary work to just sit there and study with some artificial schedule that I created. I'm simply making use of time that I have outside of my necessary work time to listen through the writings of wise men and then use what I hear when I get back to the office and have to make decisions and do things, or as I'm parenting my children or dealing with questions in my household. Constantly having my business and household and parenting, my relationships, constantly having them informed by the writings of wise men. That's how this learning is to be done. And it's why old men will be wiser than young men. It doesn't matter that some young buck got a degree when he was 20. It's got nothing to do with wisdom. But a wise man who is providing for a family, raising children, managing businesses, and so on, while also listening to the writings of wise men, that's a man who, when he's 80 years old, is going to be filled not just with knowledge about what books say, but with prudential wisdom that's actually applied and practical, put into practice in his life through the years, so that he can actually live a good life, not just talk about a good life. And again, this is why I always tell my students, if you want to seek wisdom, you have to establish a responsible life first. You have to establish financial independence first. You have to have a place to live. You have to have a means of living. If you're going to choose to get married, you're going to have to provide for your wife and children. You're going to have to take care of those things first, and those things are all in your control. I often hear young men saying, yeah, I want to get married, and they're thinking about romantic relationships with a woman, or even worse, they're just thinking about gratifying sexual desires, and they're not thinking about how that decision, which seems so innocent when you're 20 years old, is going to impact their whole life. The pressure and stress it's going to bring in unnecessarily, simply because they chose to pursue it. And if they don't have the means of providing for all of the responsibilities that are going to arise through that decision, they're going to have to accept those challenges, and they're going to greatly limit their opportunities to seek wisdom. And like I said, if they don't have a responsible, promising plan for how they're going to provide they may end up talking about books while living a life that is the opposite of everything taught in those books. And this is common today. The whole fake intellectual Christian crowd, where the men don't even provide for their families, and they're pretending that they're philosophers and theologians, arguing about idle theological questions while they don't even provide for their families. I've seen those men divorced by their wives, and I would argue justly so. When a man chooses to marry, his primary service to God comes through the provision for his family. That's where he exercises his faith, working through love, doing to others as he would have others do unto him. And that's why these decisions about getting married and starting families and so on, these are very important decisions that have implications for the rest of one's life. And it's why a man who desires to devote himself to the pursuit of wisdom needs to really think carefully about whether he wants to be married and wants to take upon himself those responsibilities. And this is why throughout history, when many more men sought wisdom, many more women sought wisdom and holiness, why they chose to not marry, and why there were so many religious vocations. The choice to marry comes with many practical implications. And if you're interested in seeking wisdom, you should think twice about getting married. And if you do choose to get married, you have to understand how wisdom is rightly sought and get this dopey college study idea out of your head. I hope that's helpful. God bless.